while preparing to take them out of the house.
I want you to consider your little sister, that's all.
Mac, I've got a gun in this house, and I swear to God, they come in this house, I'm gonna use it!
Ruth was accused of murdering a sheriff. After serving her 20-year sentence, she became a target of intense revenge from the sheriff's sons.
We're gonna just let this go?
This ultimately led to the hostage of her sister and herself.
Your dad.
You do not talk about him!
The movie opens with Ruth Slater being released from prison after serving time for murder. While incarcerated, she wrote many letters to her sister, Katie. Flashbacks show Ruth caring for Katie and the events that led up to the sheriff's murder. Upon release, her parole officer, Vince Cross, outlines her conditions and warns her against trying to make amends. Meanwhile, Keith, the sheriff's eldest son, starts stalking her. Ruth shares her carpentry job plans, but Cross suggests it won't be easy and gives her another contact. He drops her off at a group home, explaining that he'll visit every Tuesday. Inside, the house manager shows her around and introduces her to her new roommates. Meanwhile, Katie, now called Catherine Malcolm, barely remembers Ruth, and a flashback reveals her perspective. She gets into a car accident. Ruth wakes up in a hospital bed, surrounded by her adoptive father, Michael, and sister, Emily, who ask if she's been taking her medication. Her adoptive mother, Rachel, enters, and her parents insist she move home to recover. Outside, Rachel worries that Ruth's release might be linked to Katie's accident and fears Ruth will be coming to look for them. Michael reassures her that the accident was just that, an accident. Meanwhile, Keith finds his brother, Steve, and complains about Ruth's early release, revealing her location in Chinatown. He's determined to seek revenge, but Steve advises him to let it go. Back at the group home, Ruth receives an anonymous call, where the caller insults her. She hangs up and returns to her room, only to catch a roommate violating the no stealing rule by going through her bag, prompting Ruth to confront her. And forces her to leave the room, recovering an old photo of Katie. Keith is at home looking after his sick mother, while Steve gets ready to go out, but is stopped by his wife. After kissing his daughter and wife, it's evident that the brothers lead unhappy lives. Meanwhile, Ruth wakes up in her bunk bed, thinking about Katie. In a flashback, she yells at a bank employee trying to take their farmhouse, with the sheriff showing up to maintain order.
Ruth!
His next scene lying on the ground in a pool of blood. In the present day, Liz and John Ingram now own the renovated farmhouse and live there with their sons, Ryan and Daniel. Amid a family argument, Liz is interrupted by an electrician who finds baby shoes in the wall. Believing they ward off evil spirits, Liz tells him to put them back and heads to work. Starting her first day as a carpenter, Ruth discovers there's no job for her, as told by the lead foreman. With no choice, she ends up at a fish factory recommended by Cross, where she works hard all day. When she returns home and is showering, her roommate disturbs her.
Drag your bitch ass out next time!
So, Ruth pushes her when she is done. Ruth goes to the library in search of Katie, but without knowing her appearance or adoption details, she hits a dead end. Instead, she stumbles upon an article about the farmhouse's sale and decides to visit. Along the journey, memories of Katie as a child flood her mind. When she reaches the house, she recalls the sheriff offering shelter to her and Katie in the past, but she had declined, fearing separation. Outside the house, Liz notices Ruth and alerts John, who approaches her. Ruth, unable to reveal her true connection to the house, mentions working on it and building a hut in the entryway. Invited inside, she meets Liz and struggles with memories flooding back. When questioned about previous owners, Ruth is evasive. John brings up the shoes found on the wall, and though Ruth denies knowledge, her gaze gives away more than she intends, causing John to pause. Unable to hold back her emotions, she thanks the couple abruptly and leaves in a hurry. John follows, offering her a ride to the bus station. Curious, Ruth asks about his legal speciality. Startled, John tries to uncover the truth behind her visit. Ruth reveals that the house was where she last lived with her sister before her sister was put in foster care and later adopted. As Ruth exits the car, John shows sympathy and offers to assist in locating her sister. Meanwhile, back at her parents' home, Katie receives attention. When Michael and Rachel leave for work, Katie admits to Emily that she stopped taking her medication and has been having flashbacks. Emily struggles to identify the woman they see, prompting her to suggest searching for her. However, Katie is reluctant to revisit her painful past. Meanwhile, Ruth heads back to the group home, but stops when she notices a chapel that is under renovation. When she enters, the foreman initially tells her they aren't hiring, but he quickly changes his mind after being impressed by her knowledge and insight. Later, during a check-in with Cross, he inquires whether Ruth had disclosed her criminal history. She responds negatively, expressing her frustration that such a label seems to follow her everywhere. Cross sets her straight, reminding her that the title of cop killer will indeed trail her, and advises her to keep that in mind. In the meantime, John discovers the reality of Ruth's past as he listens to the various messages she has left for him. Assuming he has conducted a background check, Ruth reveals her story and desperately asks for his assistance, expressing her sole desire to meet Katie's parents to ensure her sister is safe. Back at the house, Liz inquires with the contractor about the previous owners of the property. John is taken aback that Liz is unaware of the family's history. He explains that Ruth and Katie's father took his own life, and when the bank tried to evict the girls, Ruth shot and killed the sheriff. When John returns home, Liz shares her findings with him and becomes furious upon learning that he was already aware of the situation and has agreed to help locate Katie. Meanwhile, at a retirement party for a family friend, Steve observes Hannah flirting with both the other police officers and his brother. An old acquaintance approaches Steve and requests that he pass along Ruth's work address to his brother. Frustrated that the past is being stirred up again, Steve and his brother get into an argument. Steve, who was too young to fully understand the events at the time, listens as Keith blames Ruth for their mother's alcoholism and the loss of their family home. Afterward, Steve visits his ailing mother and, while looking at old family photos, decides to see Ruth at the chapel. Posing as a delivery man, he chats with her and mentions her parents. When Ruth says they are dead, he apologizes, and she responds that life goes on. After she leaves, Steve rummages through her belongings and finds a photo of Katie, leading him to rethink his stance. He later meets with Keith and agrees that all of their troubles stem from Ruth. Meanwhile, Michael receives a letter from John, who is now representing Ruth, requesting a meeting with him and Rachel. Rachel thinks they should meet with Ruth, but Michael disagrees. However, she convinces him that it's in Katie's best interests, and they decide to call the lawyer, unaware that Emily is listening. At work, Ruth begins to confide in her co-worker, Blake, developing a friendship. At a diner, she reveals that she was recently released from prison for murdering a sheriff. When Blake is speechless, she leaves, struggling to hold back tears. The next day, a co-worker confronts her, saying her father was a cop. Feeling isolated, Ruth brushes off Blake's attempts to talk. When they meet by the water, she tells him to skip the lecture, insisting she's learned her lesson. After seeing her expression, he believes her and informs her that their lawyer has arranged a meeting with Katie's parents, offering her a glimmer of hope. Meanwhile, Emily comes home to an empty house and searches for the letters her parents mentioned. Ruth meets with the Malcolms and discovers that Michael and Rachel have intentionally kept Katie from knowing about her and have withheld all her letters from prison. They believe it's best for Katie not to remember Ruth. When Ruth accuses them of burning her letters, she has an emotional outburst, causing the Malcolms to leave angrily. Despite Rachel's denial, Ruth insists on not giving up on her sister and pleads for them to tell Katie about her. At home, Emily reads the old letters and is moved to tears by Ruth's words. Meanwhile, Katie, troubled by a familiar memory, cries alone in front of a mirror. The next day at work, Blake approaches Ruth and apologizes.
Wait 1 second, I have one thing to tell you, and then I'm gonna leave you alone.
Hey, Ruth, just stop.
I'm saying you're not.
I'm good! I'm good! Okay?
Ruth learns that Blake was also recently released from prison and that their relationship is forbidden due to parole conditions. On her way home, she receives a call from Emily, who has read Ruth's letters and wants to meet. The next morning, Steve, who has been watching Ruth, follows her. At the botanical park, Emily listens as Ruth shares stories about Katie's childhood. Before leaving, Emily mentions that Katie is a pianist with a rehearsal at a local auditorium later that day. Ruth is filled with joy and calls John for legal advice to ensure the meeting goes smoothly. Meanwhile, Steve, still following Ruth, mistakenly thinks Emily is Katie and finds out her address. Back home, he comforts his crying baby and finds Keith and Hannah together.
I screamed.
Staring at them in disgust. He rushes to his mother's house to take Keith's gun. Meanwhile, Ruth, unable to reach John, frantically heads to the farmhouse, but is confronted by an angry Liz, who tells her to leave and questions why her husband thinks Ruth deserves another chance. Ruth repeatedly insists that Katie was only 5 years old. Flashbacks reveal that it was a 5-year-old Katie who accidentally shot and killed the sheriff. Understanding the truth, Liz feels compassion for Ruth and drives her to the recital. On the way, Ruth reminisces about her last moments with her sister, expressing her enduring love for her. At the recital, Ruth receives a call from Steve, who claims to have Katie at gunpoint. He tells her to meet him at the harbor, and when she begs for her sister's safety, he coldly responds that life goes on. Ruth tells Liz that the meeting location has changed and they need to head to the harbor. Once there, Liz becomes suspicious, and Ruth reveals that Katie has been kidnapped before leaving to confront Steve. Liz stays in the car and calls the authorities. When Ruth confronts Steve, she sees Emily on the ground and pleads for her safety. As Steve aims a gun at Emily, the scene shifts to Katie playing the piano. Ruth expresses her sorrow and remorse, telling Steve that life doesn't just go on. Instead, you leave everyone you love behind. Fighting with himself. He hesitates and can't go through with it. Ruth helps Emily out of the room and stands ready to take a bullet for her, while Steve holds the gun. They lock eyes, and Ruth remembers the moment she turned herself in for Katie. In the present, she walks out with her hands raised and is arrested again, along with Steve. At the recital, Michael gets a call, and Katie, after finishing her performance, smiles as she recalls Ruth gently caressing her face. Vince arrives and secures Ruth's release into his custody. As Ruth begins to walk away with Vince, she turns to see Katie approaching. When they are close, Ruth pulls Katie into a hug, and in that moment, Katie finally feels complete in Ruth's embrace. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Thanks.